Questions or comments? Anything we need to clarify?
What does paper mean exactly?
Representative is a good way to think of it. Leo is often referred to, he's one of a few popes that are referred to as the Great. So Leo the Great, Gregory the Great, and Nicholas the Great is actually the other one. But despite his appeal, and for this authority, the successors to the successor of Peter, supposedly, vary in their ability to continue that line of argument and uphold it. So when Leo is making this argument, there is still a Roman Empire of some sort. Right? It's gradually coming under the control of Germanic tribes. But once that last Western emperor is removed in 476, that essentially put the church under the Eastern Empire. And often the Pope and the Eastern Emperor found themselves in conflict, which led sometimes to the establishment of rival popes, where there would be a bishop of Rome, one supported, for example, by the Ostrogoths, and another supported by Constantinople. All right? And so, well, I mean, they're kind of, involved in this. Damasus, a later bishop, demanded respect for Rome because of the presence of Peter's bones. He argued because Peter's bones were there, that meant that the authority should be there as well. And of course, we talked about when the Pope allies with the Franks, that leadership void in Rome is filled by the Pope. The Eastern Church, of course, is not moved by these things. In fact, the Eastern Church tends to have more of a collegial model among the bishops, meaning that the bishops work together. There is a respect for the Bishop of Constantinople, the Patriarch, I should say, of Constantinople, because of the connection between that city and the empire. And in fact, the Patriarch of Constantinople was often referred to as the Universal Patriarch. And while Rome would lay a lot of emphasis on Peter's presence in Rome as to the argument for papal primacy, the Eastern Church would also argue, well, according to tradition, Peter had been a bishop in Alexandria and Antioch as well, two cities that were on the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Right? And so why should Rome be well respected or over the church when Peter was also a bishop in Alexandria? Peter was also a bishop in Antioch. Furthermore, they argued that it was the church at Constantinople who had been founded by Andrew, again according to the tradition, right? And so Andrew had founded the church of what was Byzantium at the time, that would become Constantinople. And because Andrew had brought Peter to Jesus, Constantinople should be higher than Rome because Andrew was the first one to recognize Jesus as the Messiah and then brought Peter to him. So you really kind of complex arguments here that you may or may not find convincing, but essentially this is kind of a power struggle that's going on. Who's going to lead the church? What kind of leadership model is to be recognized? The first modern pope, however, was a man by the name of Gregory. Known as Gregory I, often referred to as Gregory the Great. While the Eastern Church certainly doesn't recognize the authoritative claims that Gregory develops, that really Gregory wields more than previous popes before him, he is the one to kind of consolidate a lot of this and really centralize the authority of the papacy. Born in the city of Rome, sometime probably around the year 540, to an aristocratic family, Gregory was well educated, had read Augustine, had read Ambrose, had engaged in a variety of educational endeavors, and originally had decided to follow his family into government. So his family had been involved in government, and he too gets involved. Living during those times of the Ostrogoth invasions, he becomes the prefect, or essentially the mayor of the city of Rome, around the age of 33. And when he does, the city is in a terrible condition. And he's responsible for the task of rebuilding that city. But it is a monumental task, and so he decides to resign after about a year as the prefect. Decides to become a monk. Really, the only property he has as a monk is a silver bowl, which he does give up. He decides to live a very ascetic lifestyle, eating very little, drinking very little, essentially ruins his health because of it. But there is a respect that the other the other monks have for Gregory. There is a quality that people notice in him, that they think he is a very holy individual. So a variety of stories start to spread about him. Eventually he leaves the monastic life, returns back to Rome, where he is made a deacon, essentially part of the Pope's administrative council. This time the Pope was named Benedict. Another Pope named Pelagius II, not related to the Pelagius that had problems with Augustine, will also later make him a representative to the city of Constantinople. In Constantinople, he will involve himself in a variety of controversies, eventually getting himself recalled back to Rome. When he comes back to Rome, he decides that he wants to go back to the monastic life. He does, but becomes the abbot or the head of the monastery he's a part of, continuing to be a papal advisor. And in fact, during an epidemic, probably the bubonic plague, spreading through Rome, he becomes involved with the Pope's intentions to try and redevelop Rome, organize Rome in the aftermath of a lot of death. And in fact, during this time, Pelagius will die during the plague because of all this going on. With the death of Pelagius, Gregory is elected the Bishop of Rome. He does not want it. He writes to the Eastern Emperor that he essentially wants the Emperor to annul his election. And so here's the Pope appealing to the Emperor, please, I don't want to be Pope, even though he's been elected. The letter is intercepted, never gets to the Emperor. He will try to escape the city of Rome by hiding in the back of a wagon. He's taken, the cart goes out, he's found, brought back. And so he finally gives in. Right? He's going to serve as the bishop. As the Pope, he evidently had some great ideals. Wanted to see himself as a servant rather than a leader. Calls himself a servant of the servants of God, a title that is still part of the papal office. And he too also exercises a variety of political authority as well. Negotiates, for example, with the Lombards, as the Lombards are trying to take over Rome, essentially negotiating as the ruler of Rome. He would also take over a variety of political functions of civil government, appointing governors, administrating the government by himself sometimes. And it's during this time that the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, becomes the administrator over that 1,800 square miles known as St. Peter's Patrimony, or the Papal States. He does, however, again, have those high ideals, and so money that was taken in a variety of places, for example, as we talked about last Tuesday, bishops often had the control of a lot of different lands, and sometimes sizable lands that would be farmed or something else, rented out or things like that. And so it would be generating income. And so Gregory's idea, which, something like that is very ripe for corruption and looking for luxury and all those kind of things. So Gregory says, no, what we need to do is kind of break that up, where some of that money should go to the bishop, some of that should go to the other clergy members, and then some of it should go to the maintenance of the property, but then the most of it should go to the poor. And so you split the money up, so it's not all going to just the bishop. It was also during his time that there were a variety of clerical issues that came up, and so he becomes really concerned about the morality of the clergy. But he's also concerned about clerical education, wanting the priests and other bishops to be educated people, not just anybody, as sometimes happened. People with power or money were buying their way into the bishopric or buying their way into the priesthood. And so Gregory tries to establish some policies that would involve the education of individuals, but also would help deal with people's behavior. Clergy were to help people, not rule over them. Additionally, Gregory promoted the idea of clerical celibacy. We had seen that before in kind of this generative state, but now it becomes kind of an official policy. Possibly the idea was, even though it was mentioned in previous classes, the bishop is supposed to be the husband of one wife. Possibly the idea was that if bishops were married and had children, that those lands that they were in control over would continue to pass down those generations instead of connecting with the church. So there's a concern about the finances, the economics of this. And so, of course, if you have clerics who are celibate, it is not going to be passed along through inheritance. So he's concerned about their education, he's concerned about their behavior, he's concerned about their attitudes towards the people that they are leading, encouraging them to seek for wisdom, encouraging them to be humble individuals. Humility for Gregory was the key to church unity. That's the way to keep the church united, is for everyone to be humble. The cleric, the priest, or the bishop should not just be a good counselor, but should be a good preacher as well. All things in the church, said Gregory, belong to Peter. And so there is a way in which he is kind of furthering this idea of papal authority. But it actually ends up being setting the stage for some things that will have an impact centuries down the line. Essentially, one of these key things was that monasteries were often under the bishop of whatever region they were found in. And so, wherever your monastery was, the bishop of that region was over your monastery. But Gregory, as a monk, kind of changes that so that the monasteries kind of directly report to the Pope. Now, right now, that doesn't seem like a big deal. And it isn't in the time period we're talking about. But down the road, a couple hundred years, this will allow monasteries and the monks to act as these kind of outsiders calling for reform from the mainstream church, because they are kind of outside this bishopric setting. And there will be a lot of efforts at reform of the Catholic Church that come from the monastics as opposed to from bishops or priests. Other doctrines that Gregory promotes include the idea of purgatory. Augustine had kind of suggested the notion of purgatory, this kind of intermediate realm between heaven and hell, but it is Gregory who kind of formalizes some of that. Essentially, the idea being that purgatory was a place where those that had not succeeded well enough to go to heaven, those that had not failed enough to go to hell, were given a certain time period in purgatory whereby they could undo their sins and enter into heaven. So you'd be sentenced to purgatory for a certain amount of time whereby you would eventually work off your sins. Other ideas that come out of Gregory, of course, the furthering of the penitential system, confessing your sins, being punished for the cleansing of sins, experiencing contrition. All of these were things that Gregory promoted and furthered, including the idea that any sort of penance whereby your sinfulness has been discovered and you're gradually being moved back within the fellowship of the church must end with a priest absolving you of your sins. And so again, it's not just a matter of between you and God, it's a matter that the church is involved in as well. It's also during Gregory's reign that you have the codification of what become known as the 7 deadly sins. Just so you know: pride, covetousness, lust, envy, gluttony, anger, and sloth. Some of those line up with the passage in Proverbs that says there are 6 things that God hates, no 7 are an abomination to him. They don't line up exactly, but the idea of 7 things that God hates. This notion had been around previous, but it's Gregory who kind of formalizes it into these 7. One last doctrine, or kind of doctrine, but related to practice as well, is the looking upon the Eucharist as a sacrifice. And it's kind of the culmination of this idea that the Eucharist is a sacrifice. Not a sacrifice that is the believer sacrificing something to God, as we've talked about before, but the notion that Christ is sacrificed anew anytime the Eucharist is observed in what's known as the Mass. So the Mass refers to a Eucharistic service. Here too, of course, are the beginnings of what will be known as transubstantiation, the real presence conflict, other things that we'll talk about with respect to practice. Not surprising, as these things are developing, Gregory will come into conflict with Constantinople, particularly the Patriarch. John IV, who is the Patriarch of Constantinople at this time, is known as John the Faster, because he fasts a lot, not that he was the Flash or anything like that. So he kind of begins calling himself the ecumenical patriarch, which ecumenical in this time kind of means worldwide. And so, it sounds to Gregory that John is trying to claim authority over Rome. And so he begins calling himself the Patriarch of the West. But Gregory says, no, Rome was the ecumenical region because of Peter. And in fact, tells John, quote, if you put more food in your mouth, fewer lies will come out of it. Keep that one. You might not be able to use that sometime. And so, not everybody is accepting a lot of these things. But those in the West, because of the centuries of preparation, are accepting a lot of the things that Gregory has said. Gregory was also very interested in mission work. We'll talk more about that probably on Thursday. Particularly interested in reaching out to the Angles and the Saxons. But despite Gregory's insistence on the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, after him, the emperors in Constantinople continued to try and assert their authority over the Bishop of Rome, leading the popes to turn to the Franks for support, as we know. Of course, this is kind of culminates in Charlemagne, as we talked about last Tuesday. Certainly, Leo and Gregory were not the only popes and the only bishops in those regions, but they're perhaps the 2 most prominent and most influential of this time period. But before we move on, I wanted to pause and ask if there were any questions, comments, anything we needed to clarify before moving on.